Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the late 17th century. The story takes place in 1689, a year already tired of itself. Europe was tangled in wars that blurred together, dynastic squabbles, religious anxieties, and kings who all seemed related, slightly unwell, and deeply offended by one another. Armies moved slowly, messages moved slower, and occasionally, entire towns failed to notice anything at all, including an invasion. Now, when we imagine an invasion, we tend to picture shouting, clashing steel, alarms ringing, maybe someone dramatically pointing at the horizon. Naturally, that is not what happened here. What happened instead was paperwork, exhaustion, and a great deal of sleep. Let's ease into it. The town itself was small, respectable, walled technically. It had gates, at least on paper. Like many towns of the period, it believed the presence of walls was enough to discourage problems. This was a common belief and almost always incorrect. The people living there were merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and a handful of officials whose main task was to appear busy. By 1689, most of them had lived their entire lives under the assumption that war was something that happened elsewhere, to someone else, preferably someone poorer. Naturally, they were wrong. Europe at this moment was simmering. The 9 Years' War had begun, pulling in France, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and various allies who all had very strong feelings about borders drawn generations earlier. Armies moved around the continent like badly behaved house guests, eating everything and never leaving on time. This particular army had been marching for days. The soldiers were tired, underpaid, and not especially interested in heroics. They wanted shelter, bread, and somewhere to sit down. When they came upon the town, quiet and dark under the night sky, it seemed almost polite to stop there. The gates were supposed to be closed at sunset. They often weren't. Gate duty was boring, cold, and poorly rewarded. The guards were local men, not professionals, and they had been told for years that nothing ever happened, which, of course, was when something finally did. On this night, the town was asleep. Shops were shuttered. Fires had burned low. Somewhere, a dog may have barked, briefly, before deciding it wasn't worth the effort. No bells rang. No watchman cried out. History, for once, did not bother to knock. The soldiers approached carefully, expecting resistance. They found none. The gate, whether locked and forgotten or simply left ajar, yielded with minimal complaint. One by one, boots crossed into the streets. Still nothing. The streets were narrow and winding, designed more for medieval carts than marching troops. The soldiers moved quietly, partly from discipline, partly because they too were tired. No one wanted to fight if they didn't have to. The invasion proceeded at the pace of a late-night walk home. Windows stayed dark, doors stayed closed. The town slept on. Inside their homes, people dreamed of ordinary things. Tomorrow's market, a late bill, a cousin who talked too much. None of them dreamed of soldiers standing outside, politely conquering the place. By the time the sun rose, the invasion was essentially complete. At dawn, the townspeople began to wake. A baker opened his door and noticed a uniform that absolutely did not belong to anyone he knew. A merchant stepped outside and saw unfamiliar flags hanging where his town's emblem had been the night before. Somewhere, a child pointed and asked an awkward question. The confusion was profound but subdued. This was not a screaming panic. This was the slow, quiet realization that something had gone very wrong during the night. Officials were located, eventually. They emerged from their houses in various states of undress and denial. Questions were asked. No one had good answers. The guards had either fled, surrendered, or claimed they'd heard nothing at all. Because, apparently, they hadn't. The invading officers, for their part, were quite pleased. This was an ideal conquest. No bloodshed, no property damage worth mentioning, no paperwork explaining why half the regiment was injured. They issued proclamations, posted notices, and politely informed the town that it now belonged to someone else. This was received with the kind of weary resignation common to early modern Europe. Many towns had changed hands before. Some did it repeatedly. Loyalty was flexible. Survival was not. What's especially soothing about this story is how little outrage it produced. There was no great rebellion, no heroic last stand, tragically delayed by sleep. The townspeople adjusted. They paid new taxes. They learned new rules. Life went on. Because of course it did. In the broader context of 1689, this event barely registered. Kings were being overthrown. Alliances were shifting. William of Orange had just landed in England. James II was fleeing, and pamphlets were being printed at an alarming rate. A town quietly losing itself overnight was hardly headline material. And yet, it tells us something gentle and deeply human about the period. Most people were tired. They were tired of war announcements that changed nothing, tired of rulers who promised protection and delivered taxes, tired of standing watch for dangers that rarely arrived, until they did, very quietly, at night. Even the elites, those supposedly alert and commanding figures, were not especially impressive here. The local governor, when questioned later, offered explanations that boiled down to poor communication and unfortunate timing. Naturally, he retained his position. History loves that kind of consistency. There is something oddly comforting in knowing that even during grand historical conflicts, vast events could hinge on someone forgetting to close a gate, or deciding that sleep was more important than vigilance, or assuming, once again, that tomorrow would be like yesterday. Let's linger here for a moment in the quiet morning light of that town. Soldiers standing awkwardly in the square, townspeople whispering, church bells ringing, not in alarm, but because it was time. Everything looking the same, and yet not the same at all. This is how much of history actually happens, not with thunder, but with a shrug. And as the day wore on, the town adapted. Children played, merchants negotiated. The soldiers found places to sit. Someone complained about the weather, someone else complained about the soldiers. Complaints, at least, were timeless. The invasion faded into routine. Eventually, the war moved on. Armies always do. The town would change hands again, perhaps more than once. Years later, people might mention that strange night when everything changed without anyone noticing. Or they might not. Records from the period are thin on emotion. They list dates, movements, names of officers. They do not record the feeling of waking up to find your world slightly rearranged. History often forgets the most human parts first, which is why it's nice sometimes to lie back and imagine them. Imagine the baker blinking at the unfamiliar uniform. Imagine the official smoothing his hair and pretending this was all perfectly normal. Imagine the guards insisting they'd heard nothing, absolutely nothing, while the entire town slept peacefully through an invasion. And imagine, finally, how many times this must have happened quietly elsewhere without ever being written down. History is full of noise, but it is also full of sleep. Let's drift gently onward from here to more rulers, more mistakes, and more moments where nobody quite rose to the occasion. There will be kings who should not have been in charge, bloodlines that did not help matters, and decisions that made everything worse, naturally. War, despite its reputation, involved an astonishing amount of waiting. For the townspeople, the biggest change came in small, irritating ways. Different rules about curfews, new weights and measures, coins that looked wrong but spent the same. the constant presence of soldiers who were mostly bored and occasionally curious. Some soldiers befriended locals, some annoyed them, some disappeared into the countryside and were never seen again. Armies, like towns, shed people constantly. Church services continued. Prayers were adjusted slightly, names carefully chosen. Clergy were excellent at this. They had survived many rulers already and fully expected to survive more. Children adapted fastest. They always do. Within days, they were mimicking the soldiers' accents, playing games that involved imaginary invasions, and asking questions adults preferred not to answer. To them, this was simply a new version of the world. Adults, meanwhile, told the story over and over. Did you hear anything? No, neither did we. Imagine sleeping through it. There was a strange comfort in the shared embarrassment. At least everyone had failed together. In later years, when the war had moved on and the town found itself under yet another authority, the story would be retold with mild humor, a bit of exaggeration, a little distance. The details would blur, but the core would remain. Yes, we slept through it. Yes, all of us. And there would be a laugh, quiet, self-aware. Because what else could you do? From a historical perspective, this event is small. It did not change the course of the war. It did not inspire reforms in city defense. It did not even reliably teach people to close the gates. Similar things happened again, elsewhere, with minor variations. Humans are remarkably consistent that way. What it does offer us is a glimpse into the emotional texture of the past, the fatigue, the resignation, the understanding, unspoken but widespread, that individual effort mattered less than larger forces no one could control. Kings declared wars, armies marched, towns adapted, and occasionally everyone simply went to bed. The invading commander eventually moved on. Orders came from somewhere far away, written by someone who had never seen the town and never would. The soldiers packed up. The flags came down. Another set went up. The town watched, quietly. Life adjusted again. Years later, records would note the occupation briefly. A line in an account book, a date in a ledger. No mention of sleep, no commentary on irony. History rarely comments on its own humor. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still gently amused by the idea that an entire town could miss something so significant. Not because they were foolish, but because they were human. They trusted routine. They trusted walls. They trusted that nothing would happen tonight. Naturally, it did. Let's let that thought settle as we drift onward. There are more rulers to meet, more fragile systems to observe, more moments where confidence exceeded competence. We'll encounter kings who believed themselves indispensable, dynasties held together by optimism, and decisions that were, in hindsight, deeply avoidable. For now, though, stay here in the quiet aftermath. The town has returned to its usual rhythm. The streets are familiar again. The invasion has faded into memory, softened by time and retelling. The gates stand, heavy and unimpressive. Someone is supposed to watch them tonight. They probably will. In the days that followed, the question lingered quietly in the air, like smoke after a candle is blown out. Who exactly was responsible? This was not asked loudly. It was not written down in any official complaint. It simply hovered, unaddressed, because everyone already knew the answer. Or rather, everyone knew that there would be no answer worth pursuing. Responsibility in early modern towns was a delicate thing. It tended to dissolve when examined too closely. The guards, when they finally reappeared, Some sheepish, some indignant, some deeply offended by the implication that they had failed, offered a variety of explanations. They had heard nothing unusual. The night had been quiet, perhaps too quiet. One suggested that the wind must have carried sound away. Another blamed faulty equipment. A third insisted he had been present the entire time, though no one could remember seeing him. Naturally, this was accepted. After all, to punish the guards would require admitting that the system itself had failed, and systems, especially those overseen by mildly important men, were rarely considered the problem. Instead, a few procedural adjustments were announced. Watches would be taken more seriously, gates would be checked more often, a bell would be repaired, possibly, eventually. Everyone nodded. Nothing fundamentally changed. This, too, was common. In the broader world beyond the town walls, kings continued to behave as kings always had. They wrote letters filled with confidence. They planned campaigns from comfortable rooms. They relied on reports that were already out of date by the time they were read. The invasion of the sleeping town became a peaceful occupation in official correspondence. This phrasing was admired for its efficiency. No mention of embarrassment, no mention of negligence, just a neat description that avoided uncomfortable details. The elites were very good at this. The townspeople, meanwhile, absorbed the event into their collective memory. It became a reference point. Before the invasion, after the invasion. Not a dramatic dividing line, but a useful one. Before, the gates were always open. After, they were sometimes closed. Progress comes in modest steps. What's striking when you sit with this story long enough is how little outrage appears in the records. No riots, no desperate appeals to higher authorities, no dramatic petitions written in careful script. Instead, there is silence and practicality. People in the 17th century were not naive. They understood power. They knew that rulers changed, often without warning. They also knew that protesting the wrong ruler at the wrong time could make life significantly worse. So they adapted, quietly, efficiently. A shopkeeper learned which soldiers preferred which bread. A tavern owner adjusted prices. A priest adjusted prayers. These were small acts of survival, repeated endlessly across Europe. The town itself became a temporary piece in a much larger game. Maps were redrawn somewhere far away. Lines shifted. Names were changed. The town remained where it had always been, unmoving and mildly inconvenienced. And then, eventually, the soldiers left. This departure was even less dramatic than their arrival. Orders came. Boots were packed, equipment was gathered. The streets filled briefly with movement, then emptied again. Flags were lowered, different flags rose. Some townspeople watched, some didn't bother. By then, the invasion had already softened into something almost abstract, a story you told visitors, a detail you mentioned when explaining why certain rules existed. Oh yes, someone might say, years later, that happened once, we were asleep. There is a quiet honesty in that admission. History often encourages us to imagine the past as more alert than it really was, as if people were constantly aware of their place in grand narratives, as if every moment was charged with meaning. Most moments were not. Most moments involved eating, sleeping, working, and hoping tomorrow would be manageable. That night in 1689 was no different. It only became historical later, when someone decided it was worth writing down. And even then, it was written down briefly.
This story survives not because it was important, but because it was human, because it reveals something enduring and gently ironic about how societies function or don't. We build walls, we appoint guards, we make plans, and then, sometimes, we go to sleep. The town did not collapse, it did not learn a grand lesson. It continued as towns do, layered with memory and habit and mild regret. New generations grew up hearing the story secondhand, already softened by repetition. Did it really happen like that? They might ask. Yes, came the answer, apparently so, and that was enough. As we drift onward from this moment, keep that image with you. A quiet street, a closed window, a world changing just outside, unnoticed. There are many more moments like this in history, where the elites failed gently, where systems faltered politely, and where ordinary people carried on regardless. We'll move next into those broader patterns, into the rulers who assumed vigilance without verifying it, into dynasties that trusted tradition more than reality, into decisions made far from consequences.
After the soldiers moved on, and the flags were changed again, because flags always change again, the town settled into a familiar, comforting belief. That belief was this: what happened before would not happen again. This is one of humanity's favorite ideas. The gates, now and then, were actually closed at night. Not always, but often enough that people felt reassured. The guards were reminded of their duties with mild sternness, and the promise of consequences that everyone knew would remain theoretical. Still, the illusion mattered. Illusions are incredibly soothing things. The town council congratulated itself quietly. After all, nothing bad had happened since, which, in the logic of governance, was proof of success. The fact that nothing bad had happened before the invasion either was conveniently ignored. Paperwork increased. There were new ledgers, new reports, new phrases like heightened awareness and improved vigilance, which sounded excellent and meant very little. Officials slept better knowing these phrases existed. The townspeople slept better knowing the officials believed them. Beyond the town, the war dragged on. It always did. Kings argued over titles that required a family tree and a generous imagination to justify. Generals wrote letters explaining why progress was slower than expected. Soldiers marched, stopped, marched again. The town became just another name on a map, occasionally circled, sometimes forgotten. And that, strangely, was exactly what it wanted. Obscurity was safety. For the elites, those perched just high enough to be uncomfortable, the invasion became an awkward anecdote, something mentioned cautiously, usually after a few drinks, and always framed as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a systemic failure. We were assured the gates were secure. Of course, another would reply. They usually were. This mutual reassurance functioned as a kind of social glue. No one wanted to tug at the thread too hard. The fabric of authority was thin enough already. What's especially gentle about this moment in history is how little blame ever truly sticks. In theory, early modern Europe loved punishment. Executions were public. Justice was theatrical. Guilt was meant to be visible. In practice, embarrassment was often far more dangerous than crime. Punishing someone for the sleeping invasion would have required acknowledging that the town's defenses were symbolic rather than effective, that authority relied more on habit than readiness, that comfort had replaced caution. Naturally, no one wanted to say that out loud. So instead, the story softened. It became less about negligence and more about fate, about timing, about the strange unpredictability of war. It was nobody's fault, really. These things just happened. History has always been very kind to those explanations. As the years passed, the invasion slipped further into the background. New concerns took its place. A bad harvest, a tax dispute, a rumor of plague that turned out, thankfully, to be something else. Life layered itself over the memory until it was no longer sharp. Children who had slept through the invasion grew into adults who barely remembered it. Adults who had lived it found their recollections blurring at the edges. Memory, like authority, prefers simplicity. Yes, we slept through it, they'd say. No, nothing happened. Yes, it was embarrassing. No, it didn't really matter. All of these things were true. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to laugh, to imagine this as a uniquely foolish moment, but that would be unfair and also inaccurate. Because the truth is, most systems of security rely on expectation rather than action, on the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, on the quiet confidence that nothing will challenge the routine. The town in 1689 was not unusual, it was representative. Across Europe, walls crumbled quietly, watchtowers stood unmanned, militias trained enthusiastically once a year and forgot everything immediately afterwards. The appearance of readiness often mattered more than readiness itself. And kings encouraged this, unintentionally perhaps, but effectively. Royal authority thrived on symbols, crowns, ceremonies, declarations. The idea of control was often enough. Actual control was expensive, complicated, and prone to failure. So the illusion persisted. The town became, once again, a peaceful place. People married, people died. Children who would never hear the invasion mentioned at all. The gates creaked open and shut. The guards aged. New guards took their place, equally confident. And somewhere in the town's archives, a thin document remained. A date, a note, a polite description of occupation. Rarely consulted, never emphasized. History's whisper, filed neatly away. If you listen closely to stories like this, they begin to echo. They repeat in different forms across centuries. Cities surprised by events they assumed wouldn't reach them. Leaders shocked by outcomes they had technically planned for. The lesson is always there. It is simply rarely learned. The town slept because sleep was normal, because night was for rest, because danger was something discussed, not expected, because no one wants to believe that history will arrive unannounced. And yet, it often does. Let's stay with that thought as we drift onward. The story of this town is not really about invasion at all. It's about comfort, about routine, about how easily human systems settle into complacency when nothing immediately challenges them. Next, we'll widen our view slightly. We'll look at the people at the top, the rulers and commanders who trusted reports instead of reality, and who slept quite well themselves while assuming others were awake. Because, of course, they were. For now, rest again in the quiet streets of the town. The houses stand, the walls hold, the gates are closed, this time for real. If anyone slept more soundly than the townspeople on the night of the invasion, it was the people far away from the town entirely. The kings, the princes, the men with titles that required several breaths to say out loud. They slept in large rooms, on beds designed to impress rather than support, surrounded by servants whose job it was to ensure that nothing unpleasant reached them too quickly. Information arrived softened, delayed, and translated into something reassuring. By the time news of the town reached higher authorities, it had already been reduced to a tidy phrase, a minor occupation, a peaceful transition, no resistance encountered. Which was true, technically, and therefore perfect. The ruler responsible for the invading forces, one of many European elites who believed deeply in their importance, likely nodded at the report and moved on. There were bigger concerns, other towns, other fronts, other letters demanding attention. This was the nature of elite life in the 17th century. Power was abstract, consequences were distant. Failure, when it occurred, could usually be reframed as strategy. Naturally, this encouraged a certain confidence. The generals, too, slept well. They had succeeded. An objective had been taken without cost. This was the sort of result that made careers quietly. No medals were handed out, no songs were written, but someone, somewhere, made a note. Efficient, clean, no complications. The town itself became an example, not of vulnerability, but of how easily authority could change hands when everyone behaved sensibly. From the perspective of those in command, this was ideal. From the perspective of the town, it was simply another reminder that control rarely flowed upward. The elites of the period liked to imagine themselves as the center of history. Kings posed for portraits, wrapped in velvet and symbolism, convinced that future generations would study their faces and decisions with reverence. In reality, history was happening quietly in places like this town, where no one was posing for anything, and survival mattered more than legacy. The disconnect between these two realities was enormous. Rulers believed in systems, hierarchies, chains of command that worked neatly on parchment. They trusted that orders were followed, that defenses functioned, that vigilance was constant. They trusted because trust was comfortable, and because verifying these assumptions required effort. The town's invasion was not a warning to them. It was an anecdote, one more example of how unpredictable war could be. Something to mention briefly, then forget. The fact that an entire population had slept through a change in authority did not trouble them. Why would it? The outcome had been favorable. The system, from their perspective, had worked. This is one of the quieter tragedies of history, not dramatic enough to mourn, not violent enough to condemn. Just a gentle mismatch between reality and belief. Meanwhile, the town continued. New officials arrived, then left. Some were kinder than others. Some took their roles seriously. Some treated the posting as a temporary inconvenience. None of them fully belonged. Authority passed through like weather. The townspeople learned, over time, to read the signs, the tone of announcements, the body language of soldiers, the small details that mattered more than official words. They became experts in adjustment. This expertise was never rewarded. It was simply necessary. What's striking, when you think about it long enough, is how little the invasion changed their understanding of power. If anything, it confirmed what they already suspected, that decisions were made elsewhere, that safety was provisional, that vigilance was a performance more than a practice. They did not become more heroic. They became more pragmatic. And that pragmatism is what allowed the town to survive long after the war itself had faded into dusty records. Years later, new conflicts would come. New rulers would argue over old claims. New armies would march, convinced of their importance. The town would watch, quietly, prepared to adapt once again. Maybe next time they would hear the invasion. Maybe next time they wouldn't. Either way, they would wake up and make bread. This is the part of history that rarely makes it into grand narratives. The part where people endure rather than triumph, where systems fail gently instead of catastrophically, where no one learns a lesson dramatic enough to change the world. But it is, in many ways, the most honest part. As we drift further along, we'll begin to see how this pattern repeats itself in royal households, in dynasties stretched thin by intermarriage and expectation, in kings who trusted bloodlines more than competence. The sleeping town is just the beginning, a small, quiet example of a much larger habit. For now, let the image settle. A ruler far away, satisfied. A general proud of his efficiency. A town adjusting its routine. Guards insisting they heard nothing. And night falling again. Because tomorrow will surely be ordinary. And if history has taught us anything at all, it's that this is usually when it isn't.